let's take our Bibles, please. Turn back to the Old Testament book of Daniel, once again, the 11th chapter, as we talk today about preparing for Armageddon. Preparing for Armageddon. You know, I said last time that people's minds are quite ripe to receive an oncoming Antichrist because of events taking place in the world today that are quite different than past eras. You know, I think of the days my own grandpa and grandma grew up and lived in this world, and there were no computers at that time. I think computers are a very important part of the last days if you understand Bible prophecy. They didn't have any UPC symbols with the number 666 on it that they were buying merchandise from. They didn't have any satellite transmission. They didn't have, to the extent that we have today, the weapons of mass destruction that would enable somebody to blow the world up many times over. They didn't have any cell phones like we have today. They weren't connected. They didn't have towers to link everything together. They didn't have AI like we have today. Globalism was not prevalent like it is today, and that's a big part of last day prophecy. They did not have that instant ability to keep track of absolutely every one of the 8 billion plus souls in this world at any given time. It was a different world. And there were so many things that they didn't have that are going on today, things that are going on today that they didn't deal with, sodomy being one of them. And we talked about the Antichrist not desiring women. That says it right there in Daniel 11. That was not an acceptable thing back in Grandpa and Grandma's age, but it is today. And the nation of Israel getting back to their land in 1948 was absolutely huge if you stop and you think about that. Israel is in the forefront all the time. It's in the forefront right now. But there's something else that's very, very interesting. Russia is back in the news. You say, well, that's no big deal. We're going to be talking about Russia before we're finished today. That is big news, because after the fall of the USSR, there were a lot of people who thought, well, you know, the old curtain's fallen and that's the end of them. No, if you understand anything about a bear, and that is the mascot, if you will, of Russia, like the eagle is of the U.S., if you understand anything about the old Russian bear, a bear is relentless. And this is going to tie in with everything we're looking at. So as we take a look at Daniel chapter 11, we're seeing now here what we call the military antics of the Antichrist. And we pick it up in verse number 40, all right? Daniel 11 and verse number 40. It says, and at the time of, notice, the end of the world, shall the king of the south push at him, the Antichrist, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. Now we find some directions being given to us here in Daniel 11 verse 40, and you say, well, what's this north business? What's this south business? From where? And we talked about that. Really, Israel is the navel of the earth, and when we find directions like this, it's always from where Israel sits, because everything pivots around Israel. That goes without saying. And so all of this deals with Israel. So the king of the south here is Egypt, because that's what you find south of Israel. Now, it mentions the time of the end. Israel is an ancient country. It's been around since almost the beginning. There's so much about it in the Bible. But now we're dealing with the time of the end for Egypt here. Egypt goes way back to Moses and the Exodus and so on. And Egypt has always been a big name in the Bible, and even since, because of its association to Israel. It's prevalent because of Israel, basically. You know, for 1900 years, Israel was not in that land. They got expelled in 70 AD, and then a final expulsion in 125 AD. And the Palestinians kind of moved in. They started squatting. And it's like the camera of heaven stopped focusing on that land of Palestine. There was like a giant yawn from heaven. But in 1948, a miracle happens. Israel gets that land back again. It's like, what? Out of nowhere. And of course, it involves some wars, one in 48 itself, another war in 67, the Six-Day War, Yom Kippur in 1973, and then just a bunch of ongoing skirmishes, including the one that's going on right now. Well, there's always been a bunch of peace treaties that have been signed as well, and that's just prophesied to happen. But here you've got now Egypt in the last days. You've got the Antichrist signing this peace treaty with Israel, and apparently Egypt's not really happy with the outcome of it. because Egypt is not happy at all with Israel being back in that land. They weren't on board in 48. They fought against them there. They fought against them in 67 and again 73. And so they're neighbors. And I've driven from Israel to Egypt and back again. And they got to get along, got to put up with each other. But there's this ongoing thing. And Egypt is repeatedly trying to get some of that land. But we find in verse 40, it mentions here the time of the end. So now we're kind of bringing it fast forward up to our time. And we find that something's going to happen with this peace treaty the Antichrist makes that gets Egypt ticked off. And so they're going to rise up, it says here in verse 40, against him, that being the Antichrist. Now remember, the Antichrist is a Jew. We know that. And so here's the Antichrist. He's going to have his headquarters where? He's going to have his headquarters in Jerusalem. He's actually going to be enrooted in the temple in Jerusalem. So the world headquarters is not Washington, D.C. at that time. It's not Tokyo or Moscow. It's in Jerusalem. The him here is the Antichrist. And we find this king of the south comes up against him, Egypt. More about that in just a moment. But also verse 40 mentions the king of the north. Now what's north of Israel? Well, Russia is north of Israel. And Russia, friend, is a very prophetic country. You may not realize that, but it's a very prophetic, biblical country. So how's this thing going to play out? Well, you've got the Antichrist and the Jews agreeing to something. The book of Daniel talks about it, and the book of the Revelation also agree that at the beginning of the tribulation period, 7 years. So at the beginning of the 7 years, there's this peace accord here that the Jews are going to embrace. They want peace. They're sick of war, ongoing it. So they're going to embrace this. But there's something about this peace treaty that Russia does not like and Egypt does not like. Apparently, they wanted a bigger slice of the pie that they get than if they get any. So there's going to be some rumblings here. You know, Russia one day is going to come down from the north to try and get Israel, or part of Israel. And we talked about it last time. Why? It's so lush, it's so fertile, it grows food like crazy, it has a climate they don't have up there. So we've got this little parcel of land that today is about 75 miles wide, maybe 150 miles high. It's about a 1/10 of the size of the state of North Dakota. And so you say, this is pretty small. And yet it's one of the world's largest producers of countless types of produce and meat and grain and things along those lines. It has a great climate. It has perfect rainfall. And by the way, it hasn't always been that way. For the 1900 years that the Palestinians occupied that land, it was I call it a giant kitty litter box, because it just was a mess. But the Jews got back in it in 48, and the desert bloomed. And so now you've got everybody wanting it, plus the mineral wealth of the Dead Sea has been estimated at $4 trillion. There's potash in there for fertilizer, and there's a lot of other things in there, elements needed for chemical warfare and so on. So along comes the Antichrist, and he gets in chummy with the Jewish people, with Israel, and they start dividing up the land, and apparently Russia doesn't like it. It spurs on an attack. And I'd like you to look back in Ezekiel chapter 38, if you have a Bible here, or you can find one in the pew there. Just before the book of Daniel, you find the book of Ezekiel. So go to the book of Ezekiel in the 38th chapter, and we're going to go back about 2,600 years in the tunnel of time here. And the prophet Ezekiel sees something coming down the road when Gog meets God. Now, it is no secret, and it never has been, that Russia would love to have those warm water seaports of the Mediterranean that Israel has. So here's Russia, and apparently, according to Ezekiel 38, they are going to march on Israel during the tribulation period. God is going to intervene. He's going to destroy the Russian army, at least 5-6 of the Russian army. The Antichrist will not have to do it here. The Jews will not have to do it. God is going to do it. And we read about it here in Ezekiel 38, beginning in verse number 1. And the word of the Lord came unto me, this is Ezekiel talking, saying, Son of man, That's a term for Ezekiel quite often in the book. Set thy face against Gog. Now we're into that region of Russia today, the land of Magog, the chief priest of Meshach. We're talking about perhaps Moscow there, and Tubal, and prophesy against him. And so we find here the words against him, meaning this is going to go against Gog. This is not good news for Gog. He's going down. In verse number 3, and say, thus saith the Lord God, behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief priest, prince of Meshach and Tubal, and I will turn thee back and put hooks into thy jaw, and I will bring thee forth and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. You say, Pastor, this is talking about kind of ancient stuff that soldiers fought with. Why in the world would man resort back to horses for warfare? Well, we talked about that last time. It may be there's no oil at that time, or they've shut down the oil, and you really can't run stuff without oil. There's a very interesting story about what happened to Germany in World War II and their oil supply. But there might not be any steel for those armored tanks and so on. Maybe they have sophisticated weapons to jam weapons like this and so on. But why would man resort back to horses for warfare? Well, there's a number of reasons. The U.S. had a cavalry of 24,000 horsemen that they used even in World War II. And the Russian cavalry has always been one that has been fearsome. It's been feared. But the other reason that they might use this kind of language here in Ezekiel 38 is because the reader of the times since then, picture somebody in the 1500s reading about tanks and jeeps and jets and so on, and they go, what? And so it might be symbolic talk, if you will, of a military that the reader would understand. We really don't know, but all we know is talking about the military might of this king of the north. Now, this coincides with what we read a moment ago in Daniel 11, where it says, the king of the north shall come against him, the Antichrist, like a whirlwind, notice, with chariots and with horsemen, with many ships. And so it's talking about the same kind of ammo here. And he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. We find a lot of the same lingo here. Now, in verse 5 of Ezekiel 38, it goes on by mentioning Persia, that's Iran, if you will, Ethiopia, we of course know that being down in the continent of Africa, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. So we find here there's going to be a bunch of forces here that are not happy, and they're going to gang up on Israel. It mentions in verse number 6, Gomer. That would be the region then of what today is Germany. And it's interesting that it adds in all his bands, because we know back in the early 90s, East and West Germany, East and West Berlin reunited again. So it mentions now all his bands, united Germany, and the house of Tagarma, or Turkey, of the north quarters, and of his bands and many people with thee. So we find here a lot of forces trying to take Israel out. Now verse number 8 goes on, and it says, after many days thou shalt be visited. Now here's God talking to Israel. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword and is gathered out of many people. I believe this is a reference to the rebirth, the restoration of Israel, which took place in the days of my folks. And so people say, well, the Bible's just outdated. It's dusty, it's crusty, you can't really get much from it. But really, folks have their head in the sand if they don't realize there are things unfolding in our day that really were prophesied to happen in biblical times. And verse 8 would be one of them. After many days. So they were scattered in 125 AD. But notice there's a visitation again in the latter years. Thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword. The Romans kicked them out of it by the edge of the sword, and is gathered out of many people, all those European nations where the Jews were scattered to, and they came back to Israel in 48 with the Zionist movement really taking its roots in the latter 1800s. But it mentions against the mountains of Israel, which have always or been always waste, but is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. So it's talking here about Israel being back in their home. And if you understand it, there's a mountain range that runs right down from north to south in Israel. Well, then, in verse 9, speaking of Russia, thou shalt ascend and come like a storm. Thou shalt be like a cloud to cover the land, thou and all thy bands. So here's Russia and all those countries we mentioned a moment ago, and many people with thee. They're going to pounce on Israel, drive them into the Mediterranean Sea, do away with them once and for all. So what happens? What happens? Well, read on. Verse 10, thus saith the Lord God, it shall also come to pass that at the same time shall things come into thy mind, and thou shalt think an evil thought. This is what all those forces from the north and the south are thinking. Thou shalt say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. Now, that was not common at the time this was written, because the villages, the cities were walled. It's talking about now. I mean, if a city had walls around it today, you'd think that's crazy. But it's mentioning this land of unwalled villages. This is a current day prophecy. I will go to them that are at rest, that dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates. In other words, this is going to be easy pickings to Russia. It's there for the taking. Well, in verse number 12, they're going to try and take a spoil and take a prey, and to turn thine hand upon the desolate places that are now inhabited, and upon the people that are gathered out of the nations, that is, the Israelites who are back in their land, which have gotten cattle and goods. It's speaking here about the restoration or the affluence of Israel today, that dwell in the midst of the land. And so we find here who's coming against them, and it mentions Sheba and Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, and all the lions thereof, shall say unto thee, art thou come to take a prey? So here's the bystanders, here's those standing back saying, are you going in to take something from them? Well, in verse 14, therefore, son of man, prophesy and say unto Gog, thus saith the Lord God, in that day when my people of Israel dwelleth safely, shalt thou not know it? In other words, let's go take them out. And thou shalt come from thy place out of the north parts, thou and many people with thee, all of them riding upon horses, a great company and a great army. And thou shalt come up against my people of Israel as a cloud to cover the land. It shall be in the latter days. There it is again. And I will bring thee against my land. Remember God putting the hooks in their jaw and draw them into this? That the heathen may know me when I shall be sanctified in thee, O Gog, before their eyes. This is not going to be good news for these forces coming up against Israel. Now, we have spent over 2 years, folks, studying really past prophecy for a reason, so that we could all wrap our minds around how God words stuff here. And we've been looking at this kind of verbiage and language here up to this point as we've talked about past episodes of things happening. Kingdoms like Babylon, the Medo-Persians, and Greece and Rome and so on. And so we understand now, okay, we saw how it unfolded in the past. This gives me a good idea how it's going to unfold in the future. This is how God gives it to us here. So what happens? Well, God is going to make an example out of all these forces. In verse number 18, it says, and it shall come to pass at the same time, when Gog shall come against the land of Israel, saith the Lord God, that my fury shall come up in my face. For in my jealousy and in the fire of my wrath have I spoken. Surely in that day there shall be a great shaking in the land of Israel. He mentions here the fire of his wrath. Now, we live in a society that says that God is all love and God is all mercy and God is all grace, but that's not true. You know, God is a balanced God. We're made in his image, and we have these attributes as well. But we find here that God is a God of wrath, and the book of the Revelation mentions God having a cup. He's very patient. It's a slow-filling cup. But when that cup fills up, it spills over the brim, and look out as far as the dwellers on the earth go. And so it mentions here this fire of my wrath. And we're looking here at the final demise of Russia and these other allies. In verse number 21, we read in verse 21 of Ezekiel 38, and I will call for a sword against him throughout all my mountains, saith the Lord God. Notice this. Every man's sword shall be against his brother. So you've got Russia and Germany and Iran and Turkey and all these allies and so on. And suddenly they're going to, instead of turning on Israel, turn on each other. And you say, well, who's going to cause that? God. That's happened before in the Bible. Remember with the Midianites and Gideon, and remember those enemies of Jehoshaphat? I mean, all they had to do was, the Jews showed up with a picnic and a lawn chair and basically just watched the opposition do themselves in, because the Spirit of God moved amongst them and they did themselves in. God's done that before, he'll do it again. There's going to be some inner fighting and some confusion apparently to this passage here. It's a supernatural act of God. You say, but Pastor, why do you say that 5/6 of these forces are going to get wiped out? Well, if you read on in chapter 39 of Ezekiel, in verse 1, therefore thou son of man, prophesy against Gog and say, thus saith the Lord God, behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief priest of Meshach and Tubal, and I will turn thee back and leave but, notice, the 6th part of thee. And so that means 5/6 are going to be wiped out. Folks, this can be a bloodbath. It's going to be a bloodbath there in Israel. You can only imagine the carnage here. Now, I mentioned a moment ago all these signs that we see taking place, and there are a lot more, of this shaping up and looking like the stage is set and things are ripe for this. But there's another telltale sign. And that is, and it's really coming to the surface, what I call an international contempt for Israel. Have you noticed that? As you followed the news, it is heightening. There's anti-Semitism, and it's at an all-time high. As I watched the news, I went, oh my. Now, in years past, we've seen the Hitlers come in and kill 6 million of them. And I've been to concentration camps. I've seen the gas chambers and the places like that. And after that took place, there was such an international uproar. It was like, oh my, how could this have happened? But while there's always been anti-Semitism, and I mentioned the Middle East a moment ago, we find this taking place worldwide, not just in the Middle East anymore. We find celebrities now that are anti-Semitic. I don't know if you've been following this. Politicians now are being openly anti-Semitic, and supporting actually terrorist groups over Israel. Do you follow the news? Ivy League educators are now speaking out against Israel. I read something said by probably the most famous musician in the world that this gal sided with the terrorists and anti-Israel. And folks, that's become in vogue. They have become the butt of jokes and a doormat. Now, for years there's been contempt against Israel in the Middle East, with Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, Iran, Russia. All of those obviously have been against Israel. But now there's anti-Semitism in the U.S. And it's just rampant here. This is a prelude to the coming tribulation, because the Bible calls the tribulation period a time of Jacob's trouble, Jacob's persecution. So when Russia and Egypt and others come after Israel, where's the U.S. as far as bailing them out? We were on their side and have been. It doesn't go back to 1948. It goes back to 1700s and through the 1800s. It's quite a history lesson. But in 1948, it was us taking their side that made them a state, a recognized state once again. Now, they still had to fight some battles. We were providing them the funds, the training, and so on and so forth. And they would tell you there would be no Israel today if it were not for Big Brother, making a reference to us. So where is the U.S. when all these countries come against Israel? Have you stopped to think about that? Well, I don't know what happens. Honestly, we can only speculate. But we're not going to be there to bail them out. Jeremiah 51 and 52 have some hints that we might be out of the picture. Revelation 18, I will look at it in just a moment here, but it describes somebody very wealthy and very powerful that is taken down very quickly. It's kind of scary, this secular Babylon that is eliminated and destroyed in a day. And you say, well, why would it refer to the U.S.? like Babylon. Oh, there's so many similarities. You cannot believe a study of this, and you'd go, yep, we just line up perfectly with each other. So many parallels, but one of them being Babylon actually at the time was a cosmopolitan of different nationalities. There was a lot of different nations coming together. And the U.S., I don't have to tell you that. We have it sitting here today, don't we? I mean, we are a nation of immigrants, and we've come in and all these nationalities, and that might be the similarity there. But where will the U.S. be when this battle takes place? Well, let me just say there's enough nukes right now to blow the world up. According to the UN, there are 22,000 nuclear weapons in the world right now, 22,000. And there's enough nuclear power in the world to destroy all humanity 55 times over. You can go online and find these statistics. One is adequate, right? They could destroy humanity 55 times over. Will the U.S. be taken out before this battle takes place? Well, I mentioned Revelation 18 a moment ago. It's going to go down in smoke, and there's going to be those who benefited from it for years, standing afar off, it mentions here, for the fear of her torment. Whoever Babylon is, whoever this country is, here's what they're going to be doing. They're going to be crying and saying, alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour is thy judgment come. For in 1 hour so great riches is come to naught, meaning to nothing. All of that wealth. Do you know how wealthy the U.S. is? If you ever want to do something interesting, compare our gross national, as far as wealth goes, to the rest of the world. Nobody even comes close. You say, how about Russia? It's pathetic. The financial difference between us and even a huge country like Russia is totally black and white. And we are so resilient. We can have a 9/11, we can have a whatever that knocks us out, a COVID, a depression, or whatever it might be, and we bounce back. And so there's all this wealth, and nobody's even close unless you take some of the Arab nation, the smaller nations, and their oil and such. But whatever this country or this city, as it's called here, is, it's going to be very rich, and it's going to be wiped out very quickly. We read in verse 19 that they cast dust upon their heads and cried, weeping and wailing, saying, alas, alas, that great city, wherein were made rich all that had ships in the sea by reason of her costliness. For in 1 hour she is made desolate. So whatever this country is, it's extremely rich. And when it's taken out of the picture, there's going to be some mourning, but mainly from those who benefited or profited from her. Suddenly it's like, oh, they're not going to buy our stuff anymore. And folks, we have so much stuff we're buying from overseas. And so we look at this and we say, could this be us? I don't know. We would have to speculate on this a bit, being the U.S., but I know this. Back here in Revelation 38, apparently we find Russia, and U.S. is not going to be there to protect Israel. She's taken out. And so where does the Antichrist get his army? Have you stopped to think about that? If we have these other forces surrounding him, where does the Antichrist get his army? Well, let's back up to that dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, where he saw the statue. The head was of gold. We know that's Babylon. And then he saw the chest in that region of the body being of silver. That's the Medo-Persian army that destroyed Babylon. And you get below that, you've got the silver kingdom, basically, or the silver kingdom there. Then you've got the brass kingdom below that. That's Greece and Alexander. And then you've got the Roman Empire, the legs of iron. Iron's the strongest, but it's the least valuable. And so as it went down the body, it got stronger in power, like Rome did, but inferior in value. But you get to the bottom of that image and you find the feet of iron and clay. They didn't really come together. And you find how many toes on that beast? You find 10. That is representative, I think, of the Antichrist power, where he's going to get his power, what we know to be the revived Roman Empire, that area. You know, there are many who believe there's a correlation between some of these organizations we're seeing propped up or being brought into place, like the EEC, the European Economic Community. There's always all these confederacies of nations, NATO and the UN and G20 and so on. I don't know how many countries are in any given one. It's always fluctuating. I think there's 30 in NATO right now. But it's just a matter of them kind of banding together with 10 units, as it were. And I think we have our answer of what area the Antichrist is getting his power from. So now we have, well, let's just say 2 superpowers gone. So you got apparently the U.S. not around. They're not in prophecy for some reason. You got Russia out of the picture, and that puts the Antichrist in the driver's seat. Imagine him being done with those. Now, this battle takes place. It wipes out 5/6 of that army. Of course, the Antichrist is going to take credit for that. God did it, but the Antichrist is going to act as though he did it. And so now he's going to not really need that peace treaty anymore that he signed with the Jews. Look back in Daniel chapter 11, if you would, once again. This is where it gets ugly. All right, in Daniel chapter 11, we move on to verse number 41 now. Speaking of the same beast, he shall enter also into the glorious land. Now we know what that is. That's Palestine or Israel. And many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. All right? What we've got here is the Antichrist feeling his oats. He comes back from that victory that God won, wiping out those armies. And now we find him going on really a violent binge. He's going to raise havoc. And verse 41 tells us many countries are going to be overthrown. This will be, I believe, about mid-trib, about the time he sets himself up in the temple as God. And there will be many who think he is. There will be many who follow him. You say, well, Pastor, how could anyone buy into that? Folks, man is wired to be religious. We know that. And really, we've seen some pathetic examples of this with the wacko from Waco. Remember David Koresh here some years ago and his compound and those who died for him? There were many that believed he was God, and they followed him. We got Jim Jones. We could talk about guys like that folks committed suicide for. There was another guy. There was a comet that went by some years ago, and he convinced his followers, well, if you're going to latch onto that comet, you got to commit suicide. And people did. They killed themselves. Well, we do know this. In the tribulation period, there's going to be strong delusion. I mean, you think it's bad now. Strong delusion. Many millions are going to serve the Antichrist, actually believing he's God, and they're going to fight for him. And so when verse 41 speaks about overthrowing countries, he has the army and the clout to do it, because there will be people that think he's God, but not the Jews, not the Jews. This is where the Jews turn away from him. And you say, well, why? Well, the Babylonian captivity did a lot of good things, in a sense. It cured the Israelites of idolatry once and for all. I mean, the Old Testament, it's idolatry, idolatry, idolatry. And they go into Babylonian captivity, and from that point on, it's like that cured them, and they come out, and it's almost like a knee-jerk reaction. They're not going to have anything to do with idolatry. And so when the Antichrist sets himself up as God, the mask slips, and the facade is over, and the Jews see him for what he is. He's going to set himself up now as God. No more diplomacy, and no more faking it here. He just comes out. And we read about this in 2 Thessalonians 2:4. It says, who, speaking of the Antichrist, opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. And by the way, from this verse, it's one of the reasons we know that that temple will be rebuilt in Israel or in Jerusalem sometime during the tribulation period. I believe they have it basically prefabricated and ready to erect in a moment's notice. But the Antichrist is going to come in, I think, at the midpoint, set himself up as God on the heels of all this, and say, I'm God, worship me. He's going to demand the Jews acknowledge that he is their long-awaited Messiah. Up to this point, they've been buying in on that. But now he's going to claim to be God, and something is going to click they're going to refuse to worship him, and they're going to have to flee. And this is where it gets ugly. In Daniel 11 again, in verse number 41, I hope I have time to cover this a little bit. It says, he, the Antichrist, shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But notice these words. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. We find these are going to escape out of his hand. And it mentions 3 areas. What are these about? Well, we're going to have to close with this. But if you look behind me here, you'll see a green arrow that points to Jerusalem, just so you can get your point of reference here. Now, these are the 3 countries that are mentioned. This map actually goes back to the time period of the kings, because that's the time period in which Daniel would be understanding, and God's using that. But today, this region here on the east side of the Jordan River, which starts right up here and flows down the Sea of Galilee and down the Jordan Valley into the Dead Sea, which is dead-ended there. Lowest point on the whole earth right here. So you've got on the east side of this area these 3 countries that are mentioned. You say, well, where do they come from? Remember that horrible night when Lot had an incestuous relationship with his own daughters? Okay. That's where Ammon and Moab came. Those people, they multiplied, and they were always a thorn in the side of the Jewish people. What about Edom? I preached a whole message years ago on who the Edomites are today, and really showed biblically. You know, you hear about the PLO and the Palestinians, the enemies of the Jews. It goes back to Esau, or Edom. That would have been the twin brother of Jacob, or the son of Rebekah and Isaac. And so it mentions things are going to go south here in Jerusalem, and those who escape are going to be over in this region. This is the region today of Jordan. Something very interesting is found over on that east side of the river, and there are Bible verses that we can connect and piece it together, and from that figure out, okay, what takes place? Where's this area they flee to? How is it that they're divinely protected? How does this thing play out? I could start on it right now, but it would take too long to talk about. And so we're going to have to pick up with this next time. All right?